Professor Plaker was my advisor, and part of the reason why I ended up getting interested in philosophy, because at that time he was heading the chair. He was the chair of both the philosophy and the religion department. And I remember I was taking a class with Professor Webb, a history of Christianity kind of class, and had an idea for a paper, but it was my first paper for Webb, and he was kind of known to be kind of a pretty tough grader. So I wanted to make sure I was on a good track before I spent too much time writing this. So I met with, it was my sophomore year, I believe, I met with Professor Plaker just to discuss my idea. And he listened to me very politely. We sat there for a while talking about it, kind of hashing out different questions. And then what really got me, though, you always heard the stories about Professor Plaker and his memory and how he had this photographic memory. It was a triple major here or whatever. I don't know what was real and what was just lore. But in that meeting, he asked me about my research. And I told him I hadn't done a whole lot of research yet. I was just kind of messing with the idea. Told him what I was planning on looking at. And he started giving me a list of books to research, which was, pretty normal, you would think. He's a professor in that area, he would know it. But then he proceeded to tell me exactly where they were in the library, on what bookshelves, roughly where they were in position of the books, and what page numbers I should look for. Didn't give me exact page numbers, but was around 77, 78, about halfway down the page, those where it'll start. And for something that just a totally random idea I had on predestination and Christian ideals, and then he kind of more sheepishly, because he's a very very humble person, more sheepishly suggested that I look at a couple of his books, and was able to tell me the exact page numbers that I should look at for his books. And I got the books. I was literally done with my research in about 2 hours because he was dead on with everything, with where they were. I didn't have to even look at a table of contents. And ended up getting an A on the paper, and which during my sophomore year was quite a feat. And it was just classic what you always heard about Plaker. He was very nice, very approachable, and also very just brilliant.
Okay, so we hop up and go over and congratulations, Ben. Couldn't happen to a better guy. And Ben looks at us and he said, "It's really true?" He said, all I've ever had from Wabash is a couple of phone calls. I haven't talked to anybody. He said, I left Sao Paulo yesterday, flew to Mexico City, and then to Chicago, then took a cab over to the Monon station. Still haven't met anyone that I know or anyone from the school. Then I took the Monon down to Crawfordsville and took a cab from the station. Still nobody. Took a cab home from the station. My wife and family, they're out of town. They went to visit, I think it was her parents or something like that. So he takes his bags in, and a few minutes later walks out, walks over to the Scarlet Inn, still hasn't seen anybody he knows. And he said, I finally got here. And you guys congratulate me. He said, this was, he said, I wasn't quite sure about this. I kind of, somewhere along the way, I kind of expected to see someone from the college come and say something about it. And then we proceeded to talk for an hour. It was a true privilege to talk to Ben for an hour.
I used to use Pete Sillin's Russian exam tape from freshman Russian as the test and alignment tape in the language lab because there were sounds on that tape that if you had a bad tape recorder or one that just wasn't up to snuff, those would be missed. And although my hearing now is not good enough probably to have made the distinction, it was good enough at that time. And so I used this exam. Well, the exam tape. Well, I was studying German. I took 8 courses in German here. I never took a course in Russian, but I had ended up memorizing the Russian tape from the Russian 1 final exam. And I listened to the tape much more for the beauty of the sound and for Pete Sillen's voice. And it would begin, this is a recording of the poem Bagash. The recitation of this poem will be a part of your final examination. Bagash. Dama stavala bagash, jivan chimadan sekvayarsh karchinu karzinu kartwanku imayun kuyu sabachwanku, and so forth and so on. Now I don't remember it all, but of course that tape did not leave with me when I left the campus in 1967, but those sounds did stay with me to some extent. And when I became a faculty member at my own institution, I asked, are you using this tape or this poem by Samuel Marshak as the author of this poem? It's a kid's poem about a woman at a train station who loses a little dog or tries to ship a little dog and the dog gets lost. And so no, of course, this is not being used anymore. But in the mid-2000s, I contacted Pete Sillens, who had been retired for a number of years here in Crawfordsville, and I live 600 miles away. And I contacted him by phone. I said, Pete, would you do me the honor of recording this tape for me? And he said, well, I haven't used it for years. I don't even have the text of it. And but he said, I'll just do what I can. And a few weeks later, I got a package in the mail with a cassette tape where Pete had, and with the text of the poem, although in Cyrillic, and he had recreated it. And he had recreated it so well that the introduction, including the part about the final exam, is on that tape. I have that tape now at home.
Norman Moore was a dean of students when I was here, and he also taught. He taught a cultures and traditions class. And I kind of need to roll back, Jimmy. The class in 1977, in some respects, was a guinea pig class. This was the first class to have freshman tutorials, the first class to do something called cultures and traditions. Mm-hmm. And although I wasn't part of that group, I graduated in 3 years from Wabash. The guys who came before me said that the class of 77 was also, to some extent, the don't worry, we're going to go co-ed someday class. And some people came to this college thinking that, so of course it never happened. But Norman Moore was my cultures and traditions professor, and he demanded perfection in class. He wanted precision in his writing, and as many of you know, he was from Princeton. He was from an Ivy League school, so you paid double attention to what he was talking about, not only because he determined your grade, but because he determined your conduct on campus, too. But he also allowed people to do oral presentations on some of their papers, which for me was kind of a lifesaver, because I was a better speaker than I was a writer back then.
One experience another with Dean Trippett. He was dean at that time. It's one of the times, I won't go into the details of it, but that's when I was a sophomore too. I was going to leave school, and I took off to hitchhike back to Chicago, and my best buddy, Joe Dooley, it was a Sunday morning, went over, knocked on Dean Trippett's door, and he was shaving, had shaving cream on him, and told, Joe said, oh, Buck left school, he's going. And with shaving cream on his face, he jumped in his car and went looking for me up the highway.
Wow. Why'd you leave school?
Well, it was I'm not sure what I get. That was a controversy I got into with our football coach, and that we got resolved. The football coach at that time, and yeah, there was some kind of controversy, and I was figuring I was going to end my career here, and I said, well, I'm going to leave. And Trippett was aware of that, and he was such a neat guy and a caring guy, and so that was fun that he would do that. Although I did get a ride, but they didn't catch me. But by the time I got to Chicago, there were phone calls, and I had to call back. And I came back in a couple days, and we talked about things, and it got straightened out. And he was the one that got things straightened out also.
Personal involvement of faculty that we had. I remember my senior year, I got pleurisy and I was in the infirmary, which was in Kingery Hall. I don't know if that still exists. But I think all my professors came by to see me and bring me stuff to keep me updated on my work until I got back to class. So somebody who's gone to a large university could not imagine such a thing, but that was the way Wabash was, and probably still is.
When we were here, we had mandatory chapel. I think it was twice a week. And one day, there was this tremendous storm, downpour, buckets. And a number of people had seen the dean in Center Hall not long before chapel. So chapel started, and Dean Trippett appeared, shoes dry, no hair out of place, and we all said, how did he get from Center Hall to the chapel?
Without getting sick.
You know, is there a tunnel? But that's kind of the aura the man had. It was like, yeah, just incredible. Yeah.
I want to say a little bit about some professors. Of course, I admired, and some were just okay. One who helped me out in my freshman years because of the stresses on me because of the fraternity life was William Norwood Brigance, who was a great speech teacher, well-known, nationally recognized, very wise gentleman. He always taught us how to speak, how to use gestures, not the so-called hooked arm, and also to have a voice to fill the room. That's what you see. And I'm a classroom teacher, have been for years. Fill the room, fill the room. In other words, because if you start doing that, you lose your nervousness. So he says, no hooked arm, because hooked arm is defensive. So you get more to open your gestures and you project, you're talking to the kid in the back row that is, and that helped a lot. So Gronert kind of liked me and Dick Peterson. He invited us he had a cabin one time, and we're out there, it was over, I guess, I don't forget the name of the street. Anyhow, he had a cabin back at his home. He made popcorn for us an old-fashioned way, and he also, we told stories, pioneer stories. He became an expert on the rights of Indians. He was testifying in courts oftentimes on the rights of Indians who've gotten a lot of their land taken away from here in Indiana.
Favorite professor, Jim Barnes, history professor, terrific guy, loads of insight, blind. And he lived down on Locust Drive, and he would walk to campus every day. And there were times I would see him because he'd walk past my fraternity house. And he had a guide dog named Rita. And Rita was a huge yellow lab, a terrific, terrific dog. I remember one time in class we were studying the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, and he was talking about subversives, and Rita growled. And he said, there's a subversive right there. And of course the whole class cracked up. But anytime Rita did something, Jim Barnes was really quick with a little quip or a line and kind of used that to advantage. A great guy. I was a history major, and he was very influential in helping me successfully navigate that while I was at Wabash. Avid swimmer when I was here. It was amazing to see because he could keep his lane. Just a phenomenal guy. Yeah.
So this is about 2 o'clock in the morning. The pledge class, armed with flashlights, are coming back down from the Crawfordsville Cemetery. Well, of course they're practicing Dear Old Wabash, so they know how to sing it correctly. Most of the police in Crawfordsville knew indeed where we were. And they also knew where the pledge class was as they came down streets and up streets and so on and so forth. The upperclassmen decided to welcome them home by locking the door so they couldn't get in. So then as they're scattering around the house trying to get in the Lambda Chi house, of course we poured buckets of water on them from up above. Whereupon screaming and shouting and a few words that only have 4 letters were brought to the fore, and I, in my wisdom as an upperclassman, went out to keep Tom Corwin from entering the house. And I'm scuffling out there with Tom Corwin. Scuffling is a nice word to use. Phil Rogers, who is a fellow class of 62, Phil Rogers comes up and says, 2 o'clock in the morning, he says, Tom, I'd like you to meet Dean Rogie. Well, I don't know, Phil, I don't really know. Tom, you really do want to meet Dean Rogie. I don't know. Tom, Dean Rogie is here to meet you. Hi, Dean Rogie, how are you today? Okay, boys, it's time to go to bed. And we all went back very nicely to bed.
So I'm very fond of telling people that I came to Wabash College because of Rob Johnson, because he recruited me and because he made me feel like this would be a welcoming and important place in my life. But I really stayed because of Horace Turner, because he was such a profound influence on me as a naive young 18-year-old who thought he knew a little something. I went to school on the coast, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a really wonderful experience. And to this day, I've stayed in touch with both of them, as well as other people on campus. But they were two what I consider to be truly instrumental people in the history of the college. Neither one of them taught in a classroom. And I actually worked very closely with Horace Turner for the next 3 years, as he was the main person that I dealt with when it came to the radio station. And I worked under my first year with Greg Castanius, who's in my class, and he really had helped the station grow. And then I kind of came along and ran it for a year, and then I came back and managed it for a year as a senior. And it was a great learning experience, the whole atmosphere, because it was a commercial enterprise and we were making money, et cetera. We're trying to make money, and worked with large staff, and it was just a great experience. But it was through the course of doing that I got to know Horace Turner, and I spent a lot of time with him at the station and at the Malcolm X Institute and outside of class. So between him and Coach Johnson, they really did a lot to shape my understanding of the world.
And around Penn Hell time, I was called into Dean Norman Moore's office. And Professor Moore was Dean of Students. And the issue, I wasn't sure what was going on, but he had received a letter from the Dean of Girls at DePauw. And in that letter, she had a list of addresses that the girls from DePauw who were going to stay over the weekend at Wabash were going to be staying. And she asked him in the letter to please check out those addresses and make sure that they were all legitimate. So he handed me the letter. Well, I recognized that most of them were fraternity houses. And so then he said, "What do you think I ought to do with this?" Well, knowing that most of them were bogus, I told him I wasn't sure. And Dean Moore, and if you'd known him back in the days, he had his pipe in his mouth and he had his tweed jacket on, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do." He reached in his drawer, he pulled out the Crawfordsville telephone directory. "I'm just going to send her the directory and let her figure it out herself."
When I came here, I was going to work with Ed Hainish in chemistry. And I did fine, but I was, as I said to you earlier, bored to death with labs, just absolutely bored to death. And and my advisor, McKinney, who became dean here, he was bored with our labs too. I think he was getting his third PhD at the time in music. Anyway, since his boredom with lab intensified my boredom with lab, I was fascinated by Jack Charles or John F. Charles in the classics, the history department. And back then in the dark ages, we took tests before classes started to get out of classes. So I waived out of all freshman history. And I had to take, having waived out of freshman history, I had to take advanced courses in history. So my first class was with him. And in a way, the rest of my life was too.
invited to luncheon that morning with President Trippett. Byron Trippett, of course, was a stellar figure in the college's history, and but I did not know him well. My dad was either his first or second hire when Trippett became president in 1956. Dad and Wendell Calkins used to debate about which one of those was first hire, but in any case, they were both about the same time. But I can remember at the dinner table in what was the president's dining room, just in the northeast corner of the Spark, what is now the Spark Center, and I happened to be seated next to President Trippett, and he leaned over to me at some point in the meal, and he said, "Dennis, what are you going to do when your dad flunks you out of Wabash the way Lloyd Howells flunked his son out of Wabash?" Now, Lloyd Howell was a retired chemistry professor and a neighbor of ours on what was then Mills Place and now Friedman Place. And I had heard the story about Lloyd Howell being unmerciful to his son, who majored in chemistry, and literally did contribute to the kid flunking out of the college. And I really didn't know what to say to President Trippett. I think I mumbled something to the effect of that I was going to try very hard not to be a borderline case. Because I remembered one of my dad's sayings, which was, sometimes you get into a situation as a teacher where you have to administer either mercy or fairness. And he said, in those situations, he said, I always fall on the side of fairness. And so in any case, I didn't get flunked out of Wabash. I did major in my dad's department. I did take 5 courses from him. It was a little awkward at times, probably I think more for him than it was for me.
My father attended Wabash, class of '39, and so really when I got to the point of looking at college, it was pretty well determined that I was going to wind up at Wabash, assuming that everything went satisfactory from that standpoint. And in those days, Freshman Sunday was Freshman Sunday as opposed to Freshman Saturday. And so we came onto the campus. My parents had brought me down to the campus. And we were walking across campus. At that point, the mall was a little bit differently configured than it is now. There was the sidewalk that goes right in front of the library went straight on out to Wabash Avenue. And the president's residence was next to the library. So we were walking up the sidewalk as we were walking across campus. The president of the college at that time, Byron Trippett, came out of the residence. And he stopped on the sidewalk, and we walked up to him. And at that point, he greeted my father by name, said, "Don, it's good to see you." Well, my father had been back to Wabash literally once in the time since he graduated from college. And that was for a reunion, I would guess maybe in the 1950s at some point. He then turned to my mother, whose name was Caroline, but who went by Sally. And he turned to my mother and said, "Sally, it's good to see you here too." And then he turned to me and he said, "And Larry, I hope you'll have a wonderful experience here at Wabash." So, I mean, it was, if there's any indication as to what the next 4 years were going to be like, that was really it.
Yeah, I didn't think I would go to college. We probably wouldn't have been able to afford it. And like I said, I was going to be a skilled tradesman at a vocational high school. And in my senior year, schools got interested in me. And there were at least 3 Big Ten schools I could have gone to, and places like Arizona State and even Ole Miss. And looking back at it, as a 17-year-old, I think it was a pretty good question I would ask, what if I should get hurt? And I can remember a coach of one of those schools, of the 3 Big Ten schools, said, "Well, kid, if you can't help us, we can't help you." So I talked to Wabash, who apparently was interested in me. In fact, Dean Trippett was dean at that time. He was involved in this conversation. When I came down to visit, I asked the same question. And I was told as long as I maintained grades, I had a 4-year scholarship.
It was one other professor story, which has almost got me booted out of here. We had a zoology professor by the name of Elliot Williams. And Elliot was into ecology. That was his big deal. There used to be a tract of land in this area called Alley Woods, where the biology students go down and study. Anyway, he had gotten a large federal grant to study the homing range of the American box turtle. And so we would go out as students in our zoology classes, and the thing was staked every 10 meters and had a number on it. But Elliot, apparently, I walked into the Wall Hall, the science labs, one afternoon, and there was no class there, it was empty. And Elliot, Dr. Williams, apparently got the idea that he could study this homing range of these box turtles by putting a spool of thread on the top, attached to the top of the shell. And then you just let the box turtle walk around and you can follow the spool. But he wasn't sure it would work. So I walk into the lab, and there's this box turtle with a spool of thread on the back of it, and it's walking around, and I knew what was going on. So I closed the door, I picked up the turtle, I climbed on top of one of the lab tables, and the pipes were exposed in the ceiling. And I had just looped that box turtle the third time around this pipe when Dr. Williams walked in. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Just a joke, just a joke, just a joke." And I made it through the course that year.